New York Comic Con drops a lot of comic book news this week, and I wanted to touch on some of the bigger ideas that were dropped. Hi, I'm Jordan the Nerd of Gold, and it was recently announced that Greg Rucka is going to be returning to Batwoman after like 17 years. He left in 2009, a couple years after creating her in 52, and did a stint over on Detective Comics with her. It was a great run with J.H. Williams. Go read it if you haven't read it. Really good stuff, but they wouldn't let him marry Batwoman at the time, and that was really dumb and bad at the time. So yeah, I'm just gonna say that it was dumb and bad decision that they didn't let Batwoman marry at that point. So it'll be interesting to see what Greg Rucka does when he's returning to the character. The story's going to take place apparently, or start at least, in Greece, which is where the artist who's going to be working on it, Danny, who's worked on some other indie comic book stuff and some recent DC stuff, but that's where Danny is from apparently. So I think that's pretty cool. But yeah, I'm excited to see Greg Rucka returning to Batwoman. I think that's going to be really interesting to see how the original creator approaches the character after so many years of development and being away from her. So the next big piece of news is that, one, Josh Williamson is apparently not exclusive to DC anymore. I was not aware of that because it was announced that he'll be writing Iron Man for Marvel Comics. I do think that's going to be really interesting to see how he brings his style from DC over to Marvel and how the audiences react to that, basically. I also think it's interesting that Josh Williamson is going to be apparently reviving the Legion of Superheroes. I think that's a pretty big deal assignment because the Legion of Superheroes are historically significant to DC Comics and superhero comics in general. They are a major piece of history, and they've some really good stories in the Legion of Superheroes. So if you've never read Legion of Superheroes, go read Legion of Superheroes. There's different periods in which you can read it, but just look up what seems cool to you, and then you won't go wrong. But I do think it's interesting that he'll be writing Legion of Superheroes. Josh Williamson's, I won't say is one of my favorite authors, but that being said, I do like some of his work that I have read, so I'm interested in seeing where this is going to go. The last big piece of news is Swamp Thing is Killing the Children, and that is such a good title that I'm mad that when James Tynion was explaining how DC was scared of it first because of the title, they weren't just like, give us the script right now because that title is so good. Like, that's awesome. And James Tynion clearly has a lot of great work with DC, a long history of it. It makes sense that he's never really left DC. He just went on to do some Black Label / now Vertigo stuff with The Nice House on the Lake and The Nice House on the Ocean. So I do think that's going to be real, or Nice House by the Sea. I think Ocean is next. But yeah, I do think it'll be interesting to see how he weaves his original creator-owned stuff with that has been a massive success on its own. The Something is Killing the Children is easily one of the most successful indie comics of the past, I would say, 10 years? Yeah, I would say 10 years. I would say it's one of the most successful ones. At the very least, it's in the top 10 of this past decade. But I do think it's interesting that he's going to be crossing it over with Swamp Thing. And because Swamp Thing is part of the original Vertigo lineup that inspired him to become a comic book writer. So I think that's really interesting to see how he's going to be weaving the personal and the professional there in a way that makes sense and is kind of autobiographical to him as a creator. So I do think that Swamp Thing is Killing the Children is going to be great. It's going to be a perennial thing where anyone who likes DC stuff and they're starting to like some of the horror stuff, so they get into Swamp Thing and then they see Swamp Thing is Killing the Children. They don't know what that is, but they read that, they love that, and they go on to read Something is Killing the Children, which is their introduction into the larger indie world of comic books in the American market. So I do think that's a great idea there. Overall, I think those are three of the biggest pieces of news that I was excited about that I haven't spoken about just yet. But let me know, what are the most exciting things to you that came out of this New York Comic Con?